The winter of 1873 carried more than just bitter winds to the forests of Vermont. For Margaret Ainslie, it delivered a letter sealed with promise and bound by desperation, a chance at marriage with a stranger 1,000 miles west. But what happens when hope shatters upon arrival? When a woman travels across untamed wilderness only to learn that her ordinary face matters more than her extraordinary heart? This is the story of Margaret, deemed too plain by a man who'd never seen her until she stood on his doorstep, and the unexpected soul who discovered the rare beauty others had failed to see. The textile mills of Millfield, Vermont, dominated. The skyline, with their imposing brick towers and belching smokestacks. Their constant clatter provided the heartbeat of the small town, where lives were measured not in years, but in yards of fabric produced. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among the hundreds of workers who poured through the mill gates each morning was Margaret Ainslie. Her auburn hair hidden beneath a simple bonnet, her slender figure lost in the crowd of women trudging toward another 14-hour day. At 28, Margaret was what the townsfolk kindly called a confirmed spinster, though not by choice. Life had afforded her little opportunity for courtship. Her father's unexpected death when she was 19 had left her mother crippled with grief, and her 3 younger siblings hungry for bread that wouldn't appear without Margaret's steady wage. While other girls her age had attended socials and church picnics, Margaret had moved from her loom to her mother's sickbed and back again, the rhythm of her days as predictable as the shuttle passing through warp threads. "You're too serious," her mother would sometimes say, studying Margaret's face with weary eyes. "Men want a woman who smiles, who brings lightness into a home." But smiles were hard to summon when fingers were raw from work and shoulders ached from bending over machinery that cared nothing for human frailty. Margaret never considered herself beautiful, not in the way that turned men's heads or inspired poetry. Her features were pleasant enough but unremarkable. Grey eyes that revealed too much earnestness, a straight nose, and lips that rested naturally in a pensive line. She possessed no dimples that appeared with laughter, no golden curls to catch the sunlight. The mirror reflected a woman who blended into backgrounds, who could walk through a crowded room without a single person remembering she had passed. Yet beneath her ordinary exterior lived an extraordinary mind. During rare moments of leisure, Margaret devoured any printed material she could find, borrowed newspapers, pamphlets, discarded books with missing pages. She created elaborate stories for her siblings, building worlds where brave girls embarked on adventures, and quiet strength mattered more than pretty faces. Her hands, though roughened by labor, could coax reluctant plants to flourish in the small garden behind their rented rooms. Could mend tears so fine the original damage became invisible. These quiet talents went largely unnoticed in Millfield, where survival consumed most waking hours and marriage prospects dwindled with each passing year. Then came the winter of Margaret's 28th year, harsher than those before, with her mother's cough deepening and her siblings now old enough to recognize the desperation in their sister's eyes when she divided meager portions at supper. It happened on a Tuesday evening, snow piling against the window panes as Margaret sat by the fire darning socks. Her mother had gone to bed early, exhaustion finally overcoming the pain that kept her awake most nights. 12-year-old Beth and the 10-year-old twins, James and Joseph, were already asleep, huddled together for warmth in the room's single. In bed, Margaret had unfolded the 3-day-old newspaper she'd brought home, saving this small luxury for when she could enjoy it alone. Tucked between reports of congressional debates and railroad expansions was a small advertisement that caught her eye. Wife wanted, successful rancher in Montana Territory, seeks honest, hard-working woman of good character for immediate marriage. Age 20-30, preferred. Must be practical, capable, and willing to help build a prosperous homestead. Appearance less important than industrious nature and kind disposition. Passage provided. Reply to Caleb Thornton, Box 426, Silver Springs, Montana Territory. Margaret read the notice 3 times, her darning forgotten in her lap. Appearance less important than industrious nature. The words seemed aimed directly at her, acknowledging what she had always believed, that value resided in one's actions and character, rather than in fleeting beauty. She shouldn't consider it. The very idea was preposterous, to journey alone across half a continent to marry a stranger, to abandon her family when they needed her most. Yet as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where her work built something permanent, where a decent man might appreciate her industry, even if he couldn't love her face. That night, she wrote her first letter to Caleb Thornton, describing herself with painful honesty, her age, her years at the mill, her responsibility to her family. She mentioned her height, tall for a woman at 5 feet 7 inches, and her slender build, noting that many considered her plain but presentable. Instead of dwelling on appearances, she emphasized her practical skills, her efficiency with needle and thread, her knowledge of vegetable gardening, her ability to stretch meager ingredients into filling meals. She wrote of her love of reading, and her hope to someday live where open skies replaced factory walls. When she sealed the envelope the following morning, Margaret expected nothing. The letter was a momentary indulgence, a dream committed to paper that would likely end in silence. She certainly never expected the response that arrived 6 weeks later, the handwriting bold and straight across the envelope. Caleb Thornton's letter was brief but direct. He described his ranch, 300 acres with a creek running through the eastern portion, a 2-bedroom house he'd built himself, a small herd of cattle that grew each year. He mentioned neighboring families within riding distance and a settlement 10 miles west that boasted a general store and monthly church services. "Your letter stood out among the responses I received," he wrote. "Most women described their appearances or asked about the comforts of my home. You wrote of work and responsibility. I believe a marriage should be a partnership of equals, each bringing their strengths to build something lasting. If you would, consider becoming my wife. I would provide a good home, honest treatment, and the chance to create a future that belongs to both of us. With time and shared purpose, I believe deeper attachment would naturally follow." 3 more letters were exchanged, each more detailed than the last. Practical matters dominated their correspondence. The severe Montana winters, the arrangements for Margaret's family, should she leave, the journey itself. Caleb offered a solution that seemed almost miraculous. His sister had recently been widowed and needed a place to live. If Margaret accepted his proposal, Caleb would pay her sister-in-law to move into Margaret's family home and care for her mother while employing the children in her small tailoring business. "They would have better circumstances than now," he wrote, "and you would be free to build a new life knowing they are provided for." The decision tormented Margaret for weeks. Was she considering this for her family's security or for herself? Was she brave or merely selfish? Finally, after a particularly difficult day when the mill owner announced wage reductions while her mother coughed blood into her handkerchief, Margaret wrote her acceptance. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparations. Margaret met with Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, Caleb's sister-in-law, a stern but fair-minded woman who arrived from Boston with trunks of fabric and clear plans for establishing herself in Millfield. Arrangements were made, passage was purchased, and Margaret's few possessions were packed into one small trunk. The night before her departure, Margaret sat alone by the fire long after the others had gone to bed. She removed the small mirror from her sewing basket and studied her reflection with unusual intensity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The face that looked back seemed both familiar and strange. The same serious grey eyes, the same unremarkable features, but something new in the expression. A spark of hope, perhaps, or simply the terror of impending change. "You'll do," she whispered to her reflection, an encouragement and a prayer combined. "You're enough just as you are." Morning arrived with pale February light, filtering through frost-covered windows. Margaret dressed in her best dress, navy wool with a white collar she had embroidered herself, and a warm coat that had once belonged to her father, altered to fit her narrower frame. Mrs. Thornton had arrived the previous evening and now busied herself preparing breakfast as though she had always belonged in their small kitchen. "Remember to write when you arrive," her mother said, holding Margaret's hands in her own. The illness had left Sarah Ainsley's once strong grip fragile, her fingers like winter bare twigs against Margaret's work-roughened palms. "And if this man is unkind, you come home immediately. Promise me." "I promise," Margaret replied, though they both knew returning would be nearly impossible once she travelled so far west. The cost alone would be prohibitive. Beth clung to her sister, tears soaking into Margaret's coat. "Why can't you stay? Why must you go so far?" Margaret knelt to meet her sister's eyes. "Sometimes we must journey far to find where we truly belong, and sometimes we must leave so others can have what they need." She pressed a small book into Beth's hands, a collection of poems she had transcribed during quiet evenings, the only gift she could offer. "Read these when you miss me, and remember, I am thinking of you every day." The twins were more stoic, having already decided that their sister's marriage to a rancher made them cowboys by association. They extracted promises for stories about wild horses and Indians, their eyes bright with adventure they assumed awaited in Montana. The parting was brief, necessity overriding emotion. Margaret could not afford to miss her train, and prolonged goodbyes would only deepen wounds that needed to heal. With one last embrace for each family member, she picked up her small carpet bag containing necessities for the journey and stepped into the waiting wagon that would take her to the station. Margaret had never ventured more than 20 miles from Millfield. Now she would cross a continent, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar. As the train pulled away from the small station, she pressed her fingertips to the cold window glass, watching her hometown recede into the distance, until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the white landscape and the curve of the tracks. The journey west transformed Margaret in unexpected ways. Each state brought new vistas, new challenges, new possibilities. She observed endless plains stretching toward far horizons, mountains that seemed to pierce the clouds, rivers wider than she had imagined possible. At night, as the train rocked her toward her destination, she wrote detailed descriptions in her journal, determined to capture every sensation for the siblings who might never see such wonders. Fellow travelers came and went, some sharing their stories freely, others maintaining careful distance. A young mother with 2 small children became a temporary companion through Ohio and Indiana. An elderly couple returning to their son's home in Nebraska offered wisdom about frontier life during shared meals in the dining car. A widower heading to California to start anew provided cautious encouragement when Margaret hesitantly revealed her own destination. "The territory forges strength or breaks spirits," he told her, his weathered face solemn beneath a silver beard. "But a woman who carries her worth inside, rather than wearing it on her face, will find her place there more readily than most." His words sustained Margaret through increasingly difficult travel conditions. The relative comfort of the train gave way to a stagecoach that bounced mercilessly over rutted roads, then finally to a mail wagon for the last stretch to Silver Springs. By the seventh day, as mountains rose on the western horizon like guardians of some forbidden realm, exhaustion had settled into Margaret's bones, and doubt had taken residence in her heart. What if Caleb Thornton found her lacking? What if the practical partnership he proposed wilted when confronted with her ordinary face and serious nature? What if this desperate gamble left her stranded in wilderness, further from home than she had ever imagined possible? Silver Springs, Montana Territory, emerged from the morning mist like a rough sketch half completed. Unlike the neat grid of Millfield with its imposing mill buildings, this frontier town sprawled haphazardly, wooden structures scattered along a muddy main street. As the mail wagon rumbled toward the center of town, Margaret pressed her handkerchief to her lips, steadying herself against the jolting ride and the magnitude of what lay ahead. "First time in Montana?" asked the driver, a leathery man named Pratt, who'd maintained a steady stream of commentary throughout their journey from the last stagecoach stop. Margaret nodded, unable to find words adequate for the moment. The mountains looming behind the settlement both thrilled and terrified her. Their sheer scale made human endeavors seem insignificant, yet people had carved out lives in their shadow nonetheless. "Thornton's place is about 8 miles north," Pratt continued, gesturing vaguely toward a distant ridge. "Good land, plenty of water. Man works hard." He glanced at her curiously. "You visiting kin out that way?" Margaret's throat tightened. "No, I'm—" The words caught. How to explain that she was to marry the man, yet had never seen his face? "Mr. Thornton is expecting me." Something in her tone must have revealed her purpose, for Pratt's eyes widened momentarily before his expression settled into careful neutrality. "I see," was all he said, though Margaret detected a note of judgment beneath the simple acknowledgement. The wagon halted outside a weathered building with a hand-painted sign, "Silver Springs, General Mercantile and Post Office." A couple of men lounging on the porch straightened as Margaret descended, their curious gazes making her acutely aware of her rumpled traveling dress and disheveled hair. "This isn't the Thornton Ranch," Margaret said, confusion evident in her voice. "No, ma'am," Pratt replied, already unloading her trunk. "Thornton comes to town for supplies most Thursdays. Today's Tuesday. You can wait at Mrs. Jessup's boarding house till he shows." He nodded toward a 2-story clapboard building down the street. "Only decent place for a lady to stay in Silver Springs." The realization that she'd need to wait for Caleb's arrival hadn't occurred to Margaret. Her carefully planned journey had accounted for train schedules and stagecoach connections, but not for the rhythm of ranch life that didn't align with her arrival. A flicker of doubt troubled her already anxious mind. Shouldn't a man anticipating his bride ensure he was present to meet her? Mrs. Bertha Jessup proved to be a substantial woman with sharp eyes that assessed Margaret's worth in a single glance. Her boarding house, though modest, was immaculately maintained, with polished floors and spotless windows. The scent of fresh-baked bread permeated the small foyer, momentarily reminding Margaret of the home she'd left behind. "Thornton's mail order, are you?" Mrs. Jessup asked without preamble after Margaret had explained her situation. The phrase stung more than Margaret had anticipated, reducing her journey and correspondence to a transaction as impersonal as ordering flour. "Mr. Thornton and I have been corresponding for several months," Margaret corrected gently. "We've agreed to marry once I arrive." Mrs. Jessup's expression softened marginally. "No offense meant, dear. We see your situation more often than you might think. Montana Territory has a shortage of women, especially those willing to take on frontier life." She showed Margaret to a small but clean room on the second floor. 50 cents a night includes breakfast and supper. Baths extra, but you look like you could use one after your travels." The next morning, after her first decent night's sleep in over a week, Margaret ventured onto the boarding house porch with a cup of Mrs. Jessup's strong coffee. Silver Springs appeared more substantial in clear daylight, not exactly thriving, but determined to establish permanence in this rugged landscape. Besides the mercantile, she could see a blacksmith's forge, a small church with an uneven steeple, a saloon with carefully painted windows obscuring the interior, and assorted businesses whose purposes she couldn't immediately determine. People moved with purpose along the muddy street, most nodding politely when they noticed her watching. A woman carrying market baskets paused at the boarding house steps. "You must be Thornton's bride," she said without introduction. "Word travels fast in small towns. I'm Sarah Miller, the doctor's wife." Her friendly smile revealed dimples that transformed an otherwise ordinary face into something memorable. "If you need anything while you're waiting, our house is just past." The church. Margaret thanked her, surprised by the unexpected kindness. Throughout the day, others stopped by with similar greetings, curious about the newcomer, but offering genuine welcome beneath their questions. Their interest should have been intrusive, yet Margaret found herself touched by the community's attention after years of near invisibility in Millfield. Wednesday passed in similar fashion. Margaret explored the small settlement, familiarizing herself with its layout while gathering impressions of the place that might become her home. She wrote detailed letters to her family, describing the journey and her initial observations, carefully omitting her growing anxiety about meeting Caleb. Thursday dawned bright and cold. Margaret dressed with particular care in her second good dress, a forest green wool that complemented her auburn hair. She arranged her long tresses in a modest chignon, secured with her mother's tortoise-shell combs. A touch of rose-petal salve on her wind-chapped lips was her only concession to vanity. Mrs. Jessup eyed her appraisingly at breakfast. "You'll do," she declared, an echo of Margaret's own assessment before leaving Vermont. "Thornton's a serious man, not one for frippery." Margaret spent the morning positioned near the boarding house window, watching the street for any sign of her intended husband. Each approaching wagon caused her heart to quicken, only to settle back into anxious rhythm when it passed without stopping. By midday, her nerves were stretched taut as harpstrings. Most ranchers come to town after their morning chores, Mrs. Jessup offered, noting Margaret's vigilance. "He'll likely appear after noon." The words had barely left her mouth when a wagon came into view, driven by a broad-shouldered man whose hat shadowed his features. The vehicle stopped before the mercantile, and the driver descended with fluid grace that spoke of physical strength. Though Margaret had seen only a daguerreotype of Caleb attached to his third letter, something in the man's bearing convinced her she was seeing her future husband. She rose from her seat, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "I believe that's Mr. Thornton," she said, striving for composure despite her racing pulse. Mrs. Jessup peered out. "Indeed it is. Would you like me to send word you've arrived?" "No, thank you," Margaret replied. "I'll go to him directly." The short walk from boarding house to mercantile seemed endless. Margaret felt eyes watching from windows and doorways, the entire town apparently aware of the significance of this meeting. She kept her gaze fixed on the man now speaking with the mercantile owner on the store's porch. As she approached, details emerged from shadow: a strong jawline covered with well-trimmed beard, broad shoulders beneath a worn canvas coat, hands that looked capable of both strength and precision. Caleb Thornton paused mid-conversation as he noticed her approach, his expression unreadable beneath his hat brim. For a moment neither spoke, the weight of their correspondence and mutual commitment hanging in the space between them. "Mr. Thornton," Margaret finally said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I'm Margaret Ainsley." He removed his hat, revealing features that matched his daguerreotype: a high forehead, straight nose, and deep-set eyes beneath dark brows. His hair was the rich brown of turned earth, swept back from his face and curling slightly at his collar. A handsome man, though not in the conventional way of Eastern dandies, with their pomaded hair and waxed moustaches. "Miss Ainslie," he acknowledged, his voice deep and measured. "I wasn't expecting you until next week." The simple statement fell between them like a stone into still water. Ripples of confusion spreading through Margaret's carefully maintained composure. "I followed the travel arrangements you provided in your letter," she replied. "Did you not receive my final correspondence confirming my departure date?" A slight furrow appeared between Caleb's brows. Mail's unreliable, especially with the recent snowmelt causing river crossings to flood. "I apologize for not being at the station to meet you." An awkward silence settled as the mercantile owner, sensing private matters being discussed, retreated into his store. Caleb studied Margaret with an intensity that made her face warm despite the cool air. What did he see? Did he find her as she had described herself in her letters, or was he already regretting his offer? "You must be tired from your journey," he said finally. "I'd intended to have the house better prepared before your arrival." "I understand," Margaret replied, though disappointment threaded through her words. Not at the lack of preparation, but at the absence of any warmth in his greeting. Where was the man whose letters had spoken of partnership and mutual respect? This stranger seemed distantly polite, rather than pleased to finally meet his intended wife. "I need to complete my business in town," Caleb continued. "It will take perhaps an hour. Then we can return to the ranch together." Margaret nodded her agreement, acutely aware of curious onlookers who had abandoned all pretense of disinterest in their meeting. "I'll gather my things from the boarding house." As she turned to leave, Caleb added, "Miss Ainslie." She paused, looking back. "Welcome to Montana." The words were correct, but something in his tone left Margaret chilled. The enthusiastic correspondent who had articulated a vision of shared purpose seemed absent from this reserved man whose eyes had assessed her with what appeared to be disappointment. Back at the boarding house, Margaret methodically packed her few belongings, her movements automatic while her mind churned with uncertainty. Perhaps she had misinterpreted his reaction. Perhaps frontier men simply didn't display emotion openly. Perhaps the journey had left her too sensitive to perceived slights. "How did it go?" Mrs. Jessup asked when Margaret descended with her carpet bag. "Well enough," Margaret replied, unwilling to voice her concerns. "Mr. Thornton is completing his business before we depart for the ranch." Mrs. Jessup's knowing gaze suggested she heard what remained unspoken. "Men out here aren't given to flowery sentiments, Miss Ainslie. Judge him by his actions more than his words." The advice, though kindly meant, did little to ease Margaret's growing apprehension. She settled her account and waited on the boarding house porch, watching as Caleb loaded supplies into his wagon. His movements were efficient, his interactions with townspeople respectful but brief, a man of action indeed, but what those actions revealed remained unclear. When he finally drove the wagon to the boarding house, Margaret had composed herself, sufficiently to maintain outward calm despite her inner turmoil. Caleb handled her trunk with care, securing it alongside sacks of flour and coffee, a new axe head, and other provisions. He offered his hand to help her onto the high seat, his grip strong but impersonal as she settled beside him. "It's about 2 hours to the ranch," he informed her. "The road's rough in places where the spring melt has washed it out." They traveled in silence for the first mile, the tension between them growing with each passing minute. Finally, Margaret gathered her courage to broach the subject weighing on her mind. "Mr. Thornton," she began carefully, "I sense that my arrival has caused you some discomfort. If you've reconsidered our arrangement, I would prefer honesty now, rather than prolonged uncertainty." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, the only visible sign that her words had affected him. After a moment, He sighed, his breath crystallizing in the chill air. "You're very direct, Miss Ainsley." "I've found directness saves considerable time and misunderstanding," she replied, echoing a sentiment he had expressed in his second letter. A ghost of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. "Yes, I recall you writing something similar." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I have not reconsidered our arrangement, but I will admit to some adjustment in my expectations." Margaret's heart constricted painfully, but she forced herself to ask what expectations have required adjustment. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the mountains looming larger with each mile they traveled toward his ranch. "Your letters revealed an exceptional mind and practical nature. You wrote with clarity and purpose that suggested—" When he didn't continue, Margaret finished for him. "That suggested a different appearance." Yes. The simple acknowledgement hung between them like frost. Yes. The simple acknowledgement hung between them like frost. Margaret fought to maintain her composure as the wagon jostled over rough terrain. She had prepared herself for many difficulties, harsh conditions, isolation, the challenge of building a life with a stranger, but not for this familiar disappointment. Not for the silent judgment she had faced throughout her life, now followed by explicit confirmation. "I described myself accurately in my letters," she said quietly. "I made no attempt to misrepresent my appearance." "You didn't," Caleb agreed, his tone maddeningly even. "You wrote that many considered you plain but presentable. I assumed that was feminine modesty. Many women understate their charms." A bitter laugh escaped before Margaret could contain it. "I have never been accused of excessive modesty, Mr. Thornton, nor of understating anything. I deal in practicalities." For the first time, Caleb turned to look directly at her, really look at her, his dark eyes searching her face. What he sought, Margaret couldn't guess, but the intensity of his gaze made her fight the urge to turn away. "As do I," he replied finally. "And the practical matter before us is that we made an agreement. I still believe a marriage should be a partnership of equals, each bringing their strengths to build something lasting." The words from his letter, repeated now without their original conviction, stung more than outright rejection might have. "You believe that, yet you're disappointed by my appearance. How do you reconcile those positions, Mr. Thornton?" The directness of her question clearly unsettled him. His jaw tightened beneath his beard, and he returned his attention to the road. For several minutes, the only sounds were the creak of wagon wheels and the rhythmic breathing of the horses as they pulled uphill. "I'm not a poet or philosopher, Miss Ainsley," he said eventually. "I'm a man who spent 15 years turning wilderness into something productive. I made choices based on what seemed sensible, and I no longer seem a sensible choice." Margaret's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. "I didn't say that. You didn't need to." They lapsed back into silence as the wagon crested a ridge, revealing a valley spread below them like a green jewel, nestled among mountains still capped with snow. A creek bisected the valley floor, its water gleaming silver in the afternoon light. Near its bank stood a substantial log house, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Beyond it lay fenced pastures where cattle grazed, a barn, and what appeared to be a vegetable garden beginning to show early spring growth. Despite her distress, Margaret couldn't help but admire the orderliness of the scene. Caleb Thornton might be disappointed in her, but his claim of turning wilderness into productivity had clearly not been exaggerated. "Thornton Ranch," Caleb announced unnecessarily, a hint of pride warming his voice for the first time since their meeting. He guided the horses down the slope toward the house, the road here better maintained than the public route they'd traveled. As they approached, a tall figure emerged from the barn, A man in his 40s, with hair the color of rusted iron and a weathered face that had seen its share of hardship and laughter. He lifted a hand in greeting as the wagon drew near. "That's Silas Whitlock," Caleb explained. "My foreman. He's been with me since I claimed this land." Margaret nodded acknowledgement, her mind already calculating what this meant for her immediate future. A foreman meant the ranch was substantial enough to require help beyond the owner's labor. It also meant another witness to whatever decision she and Caleb reached regarding their arrangement. The wagon halted before the house, and Silas approached, his curious gaze taking in Margaret without attempting to disguise his interest. "Miss Ainsley, I presume," he said, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Thornton Ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Whitlock," Margaret replied, accepting Caleb's assistance as she descended from the wagon. "Silas, would you see to the team and unload the supplies?" Caleb asked. "Miss Ainsley and I have matters to discuss." Something passed between the men, an unspoken communication born of long association. Silas nodded once and took the reins, leading the horses toward the barn with a final curious glance over his shoulder. "This way," Caleb said, gesturing toward the house. He carried Margaret's trunk with apparent ease, setting it just inside the door before leading her into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. The space was unexpectedly welcoming, clean and well-organized with practical furnishings. Built from local timber, a stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth large enough to accommodate cooking pots. Shelves lined another wall, filled with books whose worn spines suggested frequent reading rather than mere display. "Please sit," Caleb indicated a sturdy chair at the oak table that occupied the center of the room. "We should speak plainly before making any further decisions." Margaret seated herself, removing her bonnet and placing it on the table beside her. "I appreciate directness, Mr. Thornton. Please proceed." Caleb remained standing, his tall frame casting a shadow across the table as afternoon light filtered through windows freshly washed in apparent preparation for her arrival. The thought that he had made such efforts, despite his disappointment in her appearance, added a fresh layer of confusion to Margaret's turbulent emotions. "I proposed marriage based on our correspondence," he began. "I believed we shared similar values regarding hard work, practicality, and building something worthwhile. Nothing in our meeting today has contradicted that assessment." Margaret's fingers twisted in her lap, the only outward sign of her inner turmoil. "Yet, something has changed." Caleb paced to the fireplace and back, his movements betraying a restlessness, at odds with his measured words. "I had a wife once," he said abruptly. "Catherine. She died 6 years ago during a difficult birth, our son with her." The unexpected revelation silenced whatever response Margaret might have made. This vital piece of information had never appeared in their correspondence. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally, the inadequate words all she could offer. "Catherine was beautiful," Caleb continued, as if he hadn't heard her. "Golden hair, blue eyes, a smile that could make you forget every hardship of frontier life. When I decided it was time to remarry, I told myself I wanted a practical partnership rather than the kind of consuming love we'd shared. I convinced myself that appearance didn't matter, that finding a woman of substance and character was more important than finding beauty." Margaret's throat tightened painfully. "But you were wrong." "No." Caleb stopped his pacing to face her directly. "I was right about what matters for building a life here. But I was wrong to believe I could separate practical considerations from personal preferences." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "I'm not explaining this well." "On the contrary," Margaret replied, rising from her chair, "you're being quite clear. You want a wife who is capable and hard-working, but also one who pleases your eye. I fulfill only the first requirement." She gathered her bonnet, unable to remain seated under his scrutiny. "The question before us is what happens now." Caleb's expression reflected genuine conflict. Our agreement stands if you wish it to. I keep my word, Miss Ainsley. The arrangements for your family have already been made. My sister-in-law has taken up residence in your home as promised and will care for your mother and siblings. So I'm obligated. Margaret's voice held no accusation, merely a statement of fact. No. Caleb's response came forcefully. You are free to choose. If you wish to return east, I will provide funds for your passage. Your family's situation is secured either way. That was my commitment to you, regardless of the outcome between us. The offer stunned Margaret. She had come prepared for many possibilities, but not for this strange combination of rejection and generosity. The man before her was simultaneously confirming her deepest insecurities and offering an escape that preserved her dignity and her family's welfare. Why would you do that? She asked, genuinely confused. You've already paid for my journey west and made arrangements for my family. Now you would add the cost of my return without gaining anything in return. Because I wronged you, Caleb said simply. I led you to believe that your appearance truly didn't matter to me when I wasn't certain. That was true. You deserve better than a husband who cannot fully appreciate what you offer. Margaret moved to the window, needing space to think. Outside, Silas unloaded supplies from the wagon, his efficiency suggesting long practice. Beyond him stretched the valley with its promise of life and purpose, different from anything she had known in Vermont. The mountains rose beyond, both boundary and protection for this small created world. I came west for many reasons, Mr. Thornton, she said finally. To secure my family's future, yes, but also to escape the limitations of life in Millfield, to build something meaningful with my own hands, to be valued for my contributions rather than overlooked because of my face. She turned back to him, her decision forming even as she spoke. I cannot return to Vermont, not because of obligation, but because there is nothing there for me now. My mother has care, my siblings have futures, and I have already said my goodbyes. Caleb's brows drew together in confusion. What are you suggesting? That I remain in Montana Territory, Margaret replied, though not necessarily as your wife. An unexpected spark of what might have been protest flashed in Caleb's eyes. Explain. Silver Springs needs skilled hands. I saw no dressmaker's shop during my brief stay, yet surely the women there require someone who can sew. I have 15 years' experience with textiles. If you would lend me enough to secure modest lodgings and purchase basic supplies, I could establish myself independently. A loan, not charity, she clarified, seeing his expression, to be repaid with interest once my business is established. You would stay here? Alone? Caleb's tone suggested he found the idea both admirable and troubling. A single woman operating a business in a frontier town. Women manage such things every day, Margaret countered. Mrs. Jessup runs her boarding house without apparent male assistance. I imagine there are others. There are, Caleb admitted, though it's not an easy life. Margaret couldn't contain a bitter laugh. Mr. Thornton, I have never expected an easy life. I merely want one with purpose and the chance to be judged by my actions rather than my appearance. Caleb studied her with new intensity, as if truly seeing her for the first time. The afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and her grey eyes held a determination that transformed her ordinary features into something compelling, if not conventionally beautiful. You are a remarkable woman, Miss Ainsley, he said finally, far more so than I initially recognized. Not remarkable, she corrected, simply accustomed to making the best of difficult circumstances. A sudden pounding at the door interrupted whatever Caleb might have said in response. Silas entered without waiting for invitation, his weathered face tight with concern. Riders coming, he announced tersely. 6 of them moving fast. Holcomb's men, looks like. Caleb's expression hardened immediately. Are you certain? Recognized Jenkins in the lead. They're armed. Go to the north pasture and warn Davis and the Miller boy, Caleb ordered. Get them back to the house if you can, or send them to the high ridge if you can't. As Silas departed with long strides, Caleb moved to a cabinet beside the fireplace, removing a rifle which he checked with practiced movements. "Mr. Thornton," Margaret began, confusion and the first stirrings of fear tightening her voice. "What's happening?" "A dispute with a neighboring rancher," Caleb replied, his attention focused on loading the weapon. "Victor Holcomb claims water rights to the eastern tributary of the creek that feeds this valley. The territorial court ruled in my favor last month after 3 years of legal battles. Holcomb doesn't accept the ruling. And these men coming now are likely here to deliver Holcomb's response in person," Caleb finished grimly. "Miss Ainsley, I apologize for bringing you into this situation. Please remain in the house while I address the matter." Before Margaret could protest, he strode to the door, rifle in hand. Through the window, she watched him position himself on the porch, his stance suggesting readiness rather than aggression. Minutes later, a group of riders appeared at the edge of the property, approaching with deliberate slowness that somehow seemed more menacing than a direct charge would have been. The riders halted their horses at a deliberate distance from the house, close enough to converse without shouting, but far enough to react if tensions escalated. Their leader, a hawk-faced man with a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, nudged his mount forward a few paces. Margaret counted 6 men total, all armed with visible pistols. 3 carried rifles slung across their backs. "Thornton!" the leader called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Holcomb sends his regards." "Jenkins," Caleb acknowledged with a curt nod. "This is private property. State your business and move on." Jenkins's thin lips twisted into something resembling a smile. "Now, that ain't neighborly. Mr. Holcomb's mighty concerned about your welfare, what with the eastern tributary running so high from the melt. Thought we might help you manage that overflow." The deceptively casual words clearly carried threat beneath them. Margaret's pulse quickened as she recognized the implication. They meant to damage the water source Caleb had fought so hard to secure. "The territorial court settled that matter," Caleb replied, his rifle held casually, but ready. "Holcomb needs to accept the ruling." Jenkins spat into the dirt. "Courts don't understand ranching. That water's flowed through broken spur land since before you staked your claim. Paper decisions don't change natural law." "Neither do threats," Caleb countered. "Tell Holcomb if he has concerns he can address them to my lawyer in Helena, or come speak to me himself like a man." A dangerous stillness settled over the mounted men. Margaret's hands gripped the windowsill, her knuckles whitening as she assessed the deteriorating situation. 6 armed men against Caleb, with Silas and the other hands too far away to provide immediate assistance. The odds were devastatingly clear. Without conscious thought, Margaret moved to the door and stepped onto the porch, positioning herself slightly behind Caleb's right shoulder. She felt his momentary tension without seeing his face, but she kept her attention fixed on the mounted men who now regarded her with surprise. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority she had developed managing younger workers at the mill, "you appear to be interrupting a private matter of some importance." She moved forward to stand directly beside Caleb. "My arrival has already been delayed by poor travel conditions. I would appreciate concluding our business without further postponement." Jenkins's calculating gaze shifted between her and Caleb, reassessing the situation. "Didn't know you had company, Thornton." "Miss Ainsley arrived from Vermont today," Caleb replied, seamlessly adapting to her unexpected strategy. "As she mentioned, we have personal matters to discuss that take precedence over revisiting settled legal disputes." Margaret lifted her chin slightly. "I've traveled over 2,000 miles, Mr. Jenkins. The eastern waterways can surely wait another day for your attention." Something in her tone, the unmistakable note of a woman who expected to be obeyed, created a subtle shift in the standoff. The riders exchanged glances, their bravado diminished by the presence of a woman from back east, a reminder of the civilization and social constraints many had left behind. "We'll come back when you're less occupied, Thornton," Jenkins said finally. "Mr. Holcomb will want to know about your visitor." His emphasis on the last word carried insinuation that brought heat to Margaret's cheeks, but she maintained her composed expression. "You do that," Caleb responded evenly, "and remind Holcomb that interfering with my water rights now will only add to his legal troubles." Jenkins wheeled his horse around, gesturing for his companions to follow. As they rode away, Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her momentary courage giving way to delayed reaction. Her knees weakened, and she reached for the porch railing to steady herself. Caleb turned to her, his expression a mixture of concern and something resembling admiration. "That was either very brave or very foolish, Miss Ainsley." "Probably both," she admitted, her voice shaky now that danger had passed. "I saw the odds and acted without much thought. 6 against 1 seemed unfavorable. 7 against 1 would have been worse," he pointed out, though without heat. "Those men wouldn't have hesitated to harm a woman if fighting broke out. I calculated they'd be less likely to start trouble with a woman present," Margaret explained. "Men like that often maintain a twisted sense of chivalry, even when contemplating violence against other men." Caleb studied her with renewed interest. "You're not what I expected, Margaret Ainsley." "So you've made clear, Mr. Thornton." She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, though perhaps in this instance that's not entirely negative. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced Silas's return with 2 younger men, presumably Davis and the Miller boy he had been sent to warn. They pulled up short at seeing Caleb and Margaret standing unharmed on the porch, no sign of Holcomb's men. "What happened?" Silas asked, dismounting with fluid grace despite his age. "We saw Jenkins and his boys riding east toward Broken Spur." "Miss Ainsley persuaded them to delay their visit," Caleb replied, a hint of dry humor entering his voice for the first time. Silas's bushy eyebrows rose as he assessed Margaret with new respect. "Did she now? Might have to hear that story over supper." "First, we need to finish our conversation," Caleb said, nodding toward the house. "Silas, could you and the boys see to Miss Ainsley's trunk? It needs to be brought in before dark." Once back inside, Margaret sank into a chair, the events of the day catching up with her all at once. From her disappointing first meeting with Caleb to her impulsive intervention with Holcomb's men, nothing had proceeded as she had imagined during those long nights on the journey west. Caleb busied himself at the stove, his movements efficient as he stoked the fire and filled a kettle. "You need tea," he said, not looking at her. "My mother always claimed it restored equilibrium after a shock." The unexpected domesticity of the gesture, this tall, weathered rancher preparing tea like a concerned host, nearly undid Margaret's fragile composure. She pressed her hands flat against the table to stop their trembling. "Thank you," she managed, "though I think equilibrium may be beyond reach today." Caleb set 2 mugs on the table, then seated himself across from her. For several moments, they sat in silence as the kettle began to sing on the stove. Outside, the day was fading, golden light slanting through the windows as the sun sank toward the western mountains. "I believe we should reconsider our earlier conversation," Caleb said. Abruptly, Margaret tensed. "In what way?" "Your plan to establish yourself in Silver Springs independently has merit," he continued, rising to retrieve the now boiling kettle. "But recent events make me question its safety." "Because of Holcomb?" Margaret accepted the steaming mug he offered, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "Partly." Caleb added a spoonful of honey to his tea, then offered the jar to her. "Holcomb's not above using intimidation against those connected to me, particularly when he's just lost a significant legal battle. A woman living alone, known to have arrived as my intended bride, but then establishing herself separately, would invite speculation and potentially trouble. "I'm not unfamiliar with difficult situations, Mr. Thornton," Margaret replied, though privately she acknowledged the validity of his concern. Mill work in Millfield had its share of dangers, particularly for women without male protection. "I don't doubt your capabilities, Miss Ainsley." Caleb met her gaze directly. "Your actions today demonstrated remarkable presence of mind, but frontier dangers differ from those in established towns. Here, the law exists primarily on paper, enforced more by common agreement than consistent authority." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, wary of where this might lead. Caleb's expression grew more serious. "I'm suggesting a compromise. A business arrangement rather than a romantic union." Margaret set down her mug, her attention fully captured. "Explain." "Marriage in name and legal standing," he said carefully, "with the understanding that it would be a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals, rather than more personal attachments." "A marriage of convenience," Margaret translated. The familiar term, somehow inadequate for what he proposed. "A practical alliance," Caleb corrected. "You would have security, a home, and the freedom to establish whatever enterprise you wish, whether dressmaking or something else that suits your talents. I would have a partner in building this ranch, someone with intelligence and courage, who could manage household affairs when I'm occupied elsewhere." "And at night?" Margaret asked bluntly, unwilling to leave such a critical matter unaddressed. "What expectations would you have of a wife in name only?" A flush crept up Caleb's neck, visible even beneath his beard. "Separate sleeping quarters," he said firmly. "I have a small room off the kitchen I've used as an office. It could be converted easily enough. The main bedroom would be yours." "A truly separate arrangement then," Margaret clarified. "Not merely a marriage with limited affection." "Yes." Caleb's gaze remained steady. "Unless both parties agreed to alter those terms at some future point." Margaret sipped her tea, considering this unexpected proposal. "Why would you offer this? Surely there are women who would accept a traditional marriage with you, women whose appearances might better suit your preferences." The direct question seemed to unsettle him, but Caleb answered with equal directness. "There are few eligible women in the territory, and fewer still with your evident character and intelligence. What I observed today, your quick thinking, your courage, your practical approach to difficult circumstances, confirmed what I sensed in your letters. You would be an asset to this ranch, even in a marriage defined primarily by partnership rather than deeper attachment." "You speak of me as you might a particularly promising investment," Margaret observed, though without rancor. "Perhaps," Caleb acknowledged, "but I would expect you to evaluate me with similar practicality. What I offer is security, purpose, and respect for your capabilities. In return, I ask for loyalty, hard work, and commitment to building something lasting here. It's a fair exchange, I believe." Margaret rose from the table, needing movement to process this unexpected turn. She paced to the window and back, conscious of Caleb watching her without rushing her decision. Outside, Silas and the younger hands had finished unloading the wagon and were leading the horses toward the barn. The valley lay bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset, its beauty undeniable despite the day's tensions. "I have conditions," she said finally, returning to stand beside the table rather than sitting. "If I agree to this arrangement." Caleb nodded once. "I expected as much. First, I would require a written agreement detailing the nature of our partnership, including provision for my financial independence. Any money I earn from my own enterprises remains under my control." "Reasonable," Caleb agreed, "though for appearances' sake, we would need to maintain a united front in public." "Of course. My second condition is that should this arrangement prove unsatisfactory to either party after 1 year, we would seek an annulment or divorce, with you providing funds for my relocation wherever I might choose to go. Caleb considered this more carefully. Annulment wouldn't be possible after a year of cohabitation, regardless of whether the marriage was consummated. Divorce is difficult to obtain in the territory and would damage both our reputations. Then we would need to make the arrangement work, Margaret replied simply. Which brings me to my third condition, absolute honesty between us. No polite fictions, no hidden resentments, no unspoken expectations. If we are to build any kind of life together, even one based primarily on practicality, we must be able to speak truth to one another. A smile, small but genuine, curved Caleb's mouth beneath his beard. I already value that quality in you, Miss Ainsley. Agreed. My fourth condition, Margaret continued, is that we would present a united front regarding Holcomb or any other threat to this ranch. I won't be kept in ignorance of dangers that might affect my safety or the security of our home. Our home, Caleb repeated, something indefinable flickering in his dark eyes. You're already considering accepting, then? I'm considering all possibilities, Margaret corrected. Do you agree to my conditions? Caleb rose, closing the distance between them until they stood face to face. Despite her height, he still towered over her, though there was nothing threatening in his stance. For the first time, Margaret noticed small details she had overlooked in the emotional tumult of their meeting, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting he smiled more often than she had yet witnessed, the streak of premature silver. At his right temple, the unexpected gentleness in hands that had clearly known hard labor. I agree to your conditions, Margaret Ainsley, he said, her full name emerging with a cadence that suggested respect rather than familiarity. And I offer one of my own, which is that we give ourselves permission to discover who we might become together beyond the terms of our arrangement, he said quietly, that neither of us closes the door to possibilities beyond what we can currently imagine. The request contained layers Margaret hadn't anticipated: vulnerability beneath Caleb's practical exterior, hope despite his admitted disappointment in her appearance, a willingness to let time and shared experience reshape initial impressions. That seems reasonable, she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. Though I make no promises regarding outcomes. Nor do I, Caleb replied. Only that the possibility remains. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, followed by Silas's entrance. The older man paused, clearly sensing he had intruded on something significant. Supper's nearly ready in the bunkhouse, he announced. Thought you might want to bring Miss Ainsley over rather than cooking after her long journey. Davis makes a decent venison stew. Caleb looked to Margaret, silently deferring to her preference, a small gesture that somehow carried greater significance than their entire previous conversation. Thank you, she said to Silas. I'd welcome the opportunity to meet everyone properly. Will be there shortly, Caleb added. Once Silas had departed, he turned back to Margaret. Have we reached an agreement then? Margaret considered the man before her, not the husband she had imagined during those long nights in Vermont, but perhaps something equally valuable, a potential ally who recognized her worth beyond surface appearances, who offered security, without demanding submission, who had created something substantial from raw wilderness and invited her to help shape its future. Yes, she said finally, we have an agreement, Mr. Thornton. Caleb, he corrected gently. If we're to be married even under these unusual terms, I think first names would be appropriate. Caleb, Margaret repeated, testing the shape of it on her tongue. And I am Margaret, he offered his arm with unexpected formality. Shall we join the others for supper, Margaret? I believe introductions are in order. As they walked toward the bunkhouse, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, Margaret felt something unexpected unfurl within her chest. Not love or even attraction, but possibility. The future stretching before her was not what she had envisioned when boarding that train in Vermont, but it held promise nonetheless. Perhaps, she reflected, adjusting to the rhythm of Caleb's longer stride, the plainness that had defined her in Millfield might prove to be an advantage rather than a liability in this raw new world where substance mattered more than appearance, where hands that could work were valued above hands that merely looked elegant. For the first time since arriving in Montana Territory, Margaret allowed herself to hope that she might have found not just security, but belonging. The bunkhouse was a long, low structure, built of the same sturdy logs as the main house, but with less refinement in its details. Margaret hesitated briefly at the threshold as masculine voices and laughter spilled through the open door. She had worked alongside men at the mill, but always with the protective barrier of machinery between them, never in this domestic intimacy of a shared meal. Caleb sensed her hesitation. "They're good men," he assured her quietly. "Rough in manner sometimes, but respectful." "I'm not concerned about their behavior," Margaret replied, squaring her shoulders. "I'm considering how best to establish my position. First impressions matter in any household." Something like appreciation flickered in Caleb's eyes. "Indeed they do." He led her inside, where conversation immediately ceased. 5 men of varying ages sat around a long table, their weathered faces turning toward her with undisguised curiosity. Silas stood by a large iron stove, ladling stew into wooden bowls. "This is Miss Margaret Ainsley," Caleb announced, his voice carrying authority without harshness. "She has traveled from Vermont to become my wife. We'll be married by Reverend Collins in Silver Springs as soon as arrangements can be made." The directness of his announcement, with no mention of their unusual arrangement, sent a flush of warmth to Margaret's cheeks, but she maintained a composed expression, nodding in greeting. "How do you do, gentlemen?" she said, her voice steady. "I look forward to becoming acquainted with each of you." Silas stepped forward, assuming the role of master of ceremonies. "This here's Thomas Davis." He indicated a man of perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed brown beard, best horse handler in 3 territories. Davis ducked his head in acknowledgement, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Samuel Miller," Silas continued, gesturing to a boy who couldn't be more than 16, freckled and red-haired. "Our newest hand, but learning quick." The boy blushed furiously, managing a mumbled greeting. Brothers Eli and Jacob Harrison, 2 men in their 20s with similar square-jawed features, nodded in unison, and Pedro Morales, best tracker this side of the Rockies. The last man, older than the others with silver-streaked black hair and deep-set eyes, rose partially from his seat in a courtly half-bow that spoke of different cultural traditions. "Welcome to Thornton Ranch, señorita," he said, his accented English warm with sincerity. "It has been too long without a woman's presence." "Thank you, Mr. Morales," Margaret replied. "Though I suspect a woman's presence brings changes not everyone welcomes." A chuckle rippled around the table, breaking the initial tension. Silas gestured toward 2 empty places at the head of the table. "Food's getting cold. Plenty of time for jaw-wagging after we eat." The meal itself was indeed surprisingly good. Venison stew rich with vegetables stored from the previous fall's harvest. Fresh baked bread that Margaret learned the men took turns preparing, and a dried apple cobbler for dessert. Throughout the meal, she observed the interactions around her with careful attention, noting the hierarchy, the easy camaraderie, and most importantly, the obvious respect they held for Caleb. These men were more than hired hands. They had become something like family in this isolated setting. Their conversation revealed a deep knowledge of the ranch operations and genuine investment in its success. By the meal's end, Margaret had catalogued valuable information. Thomas Davis's sister in Silver Springs was married to the mercantile owner. Young Samuel was sending half his wages to a widowed mother in Ohio. The Harrison brothers had claimed adjoining land to the north, but worked for Caleb to earn startup capital for their own ranch. Pedro had been with Caleb nearly as long as Silas, having come north from Texas after the war. "Miss Ainsley," Thomas addressed her as the dishes were being cleared, "might I ask what brings a lady such as yourself all the way from Vermont to Montana territory? It's not a journey many women would undertake." The question held genuine curiosity without judgment. Margaret considered her response carefully, aware that her answer would establish the foundation of her relationship with these men. "I came seeking purpose, Mr. Davis," she replied truthfully. "In Millfield, I worked at the textile mill 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, yet never seemed to advance beyond mere survival. When Mr. Thornton's advertisement spoke of building something lasting in partnership, it resonated with ambitions I had nearly abandoned." Her honesty appeared to surprise and impress them. Pedro nodded slowly, approval evident in his expression. "Building something from nothing. This is the dream that brings us all to such places, no?" "Indeed, Mr. Morales," Margaret agreed. "Though I suspect that challenges take different forms for men and women." "You'll face your share here," Silas commented, his tone matter-of-fact rather than discouraging. "Winters that freeze the blood, summers dry enough to parch the soul, isolation that makes you forget the sound of voices beyond these walls." "Yet you've all chosen to remain," Margaret observed. "Because the rewards match the challenges," Caleb said, speaking for the first time since the meal began. "Freedom to shape your own destiny, satisfaction in seeing tangible results from your labor, a connection to the land that becomes part of your very being." The poetry in his unexpected words caught Margaret off guard. This was a side of Caleb. Thornton she hadn't glimpsed in their earlier interactions, a man capable of articulating profound attachment to something beyond mere property ownership. She studied him with new interest as conversation flowed around them, wondering what other layers remained hidden beneath his practical exterior. Later, as they walked back to the main house under a canopy of stars, more brilliant than any Margaret had seen in Vermont, she found herself reluctant to break the comfortable silence that had settled between them. The vastness of the night sky, the distant howl of a wolf, the scent of pine and sage, all created a sensory experience so different from her previous life that words seemed inadequate. "You should know," Caleb said finally as they approached. "The house. That Holcomb's visit today wasn't coincidental. He likely heard about your expected arrival from someone in Silver Springs." Margaret considered this. "You believe he timed his intimidation attempt deliberately?" "It would align with his past behavior," Caleb confirmed. "Holcomb exploits perceived vulnerabilities. A rancher distracted by a new bride might seem an easier target." "Instead, he found the bride an unexpected complication," Margaret observed. With dry humor, Caleb's laugh, the first she'd heard from him, held genuine amusement. "Indeed he did. Jenkins's face when you stepped onto that porch. I wish I could have captured it somehow." His laughter transformed his features, softening, the stern lines and revealing glimpses of a younger man beneath the weathered exterior. Margaret found herself smiling in response, the tension of the day's events easing between them. Inside the house, practical matters reasserted themselves. Caleb showed her to the main bedroom, a surprisingly comfortable space with a substantial bed, a chest of drawers, and even a small settee beneath the window. Her trunk had been placed at the foot of the bed. "The washroom is through that door," he explained, indicating a small adjoining space that contained a copper tub and washing. "Stand. I'll bring heated water for your bath." "Thank you," Margaret said, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of these arrangements, despite their agreement. "But I can manage that myself." "Not tonight," Caleb replied firmly. "You've traveled thousands. of miles and faced down armed men within hours of your arrival. Allow me this small service as your host, if not as your whatever I am to become." The acknowledgement of their unusual situation hung between them momentarily, but Margaret found herself too exhausted to navigate its complexities further. She nodded acceptance, and Caleb departed to heat water at the kitchen stove. Alone for the first time since her arrival, Margaret surveyed what was to become her domain. The room bore few personal touches: a book on the bedside table, a faded quilt that might have been handmade, a daguerreotype on the chest that she carefully avoided examining too closely, suspecting it portrayed Catherine, Caleb's deceased wife. Yet the space was clean, solid, and far more comfortable than her rented room above the bakery in Millfield. By the time Caleb returned with steaming buckets of water, Margaret had unpacked her nightgown and toiletries. They worked together in silence to fill the copper tub, an unexpectedly domestic collaboration that felt strangely natural despite their brief acquaintance. "I'll sleep in my office tonight," Caleb told her when the preparations were complete. "Tomorrow we can discuss any changes you'd like to make to the house." "Thank you," Margaret said simply, then added on impulse, "for the water and for honoring our agreement so readily." Something complicated passed across his features. "I keep my word, Margaret, always. Sleep well." After he departed, Margaret sank into the steaming bath with a sigh that released tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. The events of the day replayed in her mind as she washed away the dust of travel, her initial disappointment upon meeting Caleb, the painful confirmation that her appearance had once again determined her value in a man's eyes, the unexpected opportunity to demonstrate courage during Holcomb's men's visit, and finally, this strange compromise that offered security without affection. Not for the first time in her life, Margaret found herself navigating a path she hadn't anticipated. Yet as the warm water eased her travel-worn body, she acknowledged that this unexpected arrangement might offer advantages her original expectations had not included. A partnership based on mutual respect and practicality might prove more enduring than one founded on romantic notions that could fade when confronted with the harsh realities of frontier life. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through. Curtains Margaret hadn't noticed the previous night, simple but finely woven fabric that softened the room's utilitarian aspects. She dressed quickly in her third and final good dress, mentally noting the necessity of creating new clothing suitable for ranch life. The practical skills that had sustained her family in Vermont would serve her equally well here, though the requirements would differ significantly. She found Caleb in the kitchen, already dressed and preparing a simple breakfast of bacon, eggs, and coffee. The domesticity of the scene struck her again, this tall, capable man performing tasks many Eastern men would consider beneath them. "Good morning," he greeted her, gesturing toward a steaming cup on the table. "I hope you slept well." "Better than expected," Margaret admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully, "though I found myself listening to unfamiliar sounds. Coyotes, perhaps?" "Likely," Caleb nodded, turning the bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "You'll grow accustomed to them in time. Most newcomers find the silence more disturbing than the wildlife." The casual confidence that she would remain long enough to adjust registered with Margaret, though she made no comment on it. Instead, she rose and moved to his side. "May I assist? I should learn your kitchen's organization." A flash of surprise crossed his features, quickly replaced by appreciation. "Of course, though I should warn you that my culinary skills are limited. Catherine was an excellent cook, but after her passing, I mastered only the basics." The mention of his deceased wife hung briefly in the air between them. Margaret acknowledged it with a nod, but didn't pursue the subject, sensing it remained tender despite the years that had passed. They worked alongside each other with surprising ease, Margaret quickly assessing the kitchen's organization and supplies, while Caleb finished cooking. By the time they seated themselves at the table, she had mentally catalogued necessary improvements and additions that would make the space more efficient. "I'd like to ride into Silver Springs today," Caleb said as they ate, "to speak with Reverend Collins about the wedding service and to introduce you properly to the community." Margaret looked up from her plate. "So soon?" "I think it's wise," he replied. "Rumors spread quickly in small settlements. Better to establish our intentions clearly, from the beginning, particularly given Holcomb's interest in our situation." The practical reasoning aligned with Margaret's own thoughts, though she hadn't expected to re-enter the public eye quite so quickly after yesterday's events. "Very well. Should I prepare for an overnight stay, or will we return today?" "We'll return by nightfall," Caleb assured her. "Though there are matters you might wish to address in town, ordering supplies not available at the ranch, establishing connections with other women in the community." Margaret considered this, appreciating his foresight. "Yes, that would be sensible. I should begin creating proper household inventories as well, to determine what might be needed." Caleb studied her with that same look of mild surprise he'd displayed earlier. "You approach this very methodically. Managing a household is not unlike managing a factory floor, Mr. Thornton." "Caleb," she corrected herself. "Both require organization, efficiency, and anticipation of future needs. I believe you'll find ranch life suits your practical nature," he observed, something like admiration warming his tone. Catherine struggled with the isolation and unpredictability. She was raised in Boston, and Montana's wildness sometimes overwhelmed her. This second, more detailed reference to his late wife caught Margaret's attention. "You loved her very much," she said quietly. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. Caleb's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "I did. Our marriage wasn't arranged as ours will be. We met in St. Louis when I was securing supplies for my first cattle drive. She was visiting relatives, dreaming of adventure." A wistful quality entered his voice. "I convinced her that life in the territory would provide that adventure. I didn't sufficiently consider how different it would be from everything she had known." The regret in his words revealed more than perhaps he intended. Not just grief for Catherine's death, but guilt over her unhappiness during life. Margaret absorbed this insight without comment, filing it away as an important piece of the complex man she had agreed to marry. "I'm not seeking adventure, Caleb," she said finally, "merely purpose and security. I believe those are things you can provide, as I can provide organization and support for your endeavors." Relief flickered across his features. "Then we understand each other." "We're beginning to," Margaret amended. "Understanding takes time." After breakfast, they prepared for the journey to Silver Springs. Margaret changed into her traveling dress, now cleaned of the previous day's dust, and pinned her hair into a simple but neat arrangement. When she emerged from the bedroom, Caleb was waiting with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Before we leave," he said, an uncharacteristic hesitancy in his manner, "I have something for you." Surprised, Margaret accepted the package, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden box. Opening it, she found a simple gold band nestled on a bed of velvet. "It was my mother's," Caleb explained. "I had Silas retrieve it from my safe this morning. If we're to announce our engagement, you should have a ring." Margaret lifted the band, noting its solid weight and smooth interior, evidence of many years' wear. "It's lovely," she said truthfully. "Are you certain you wish me to have it, given the nature of our arrangement?" Caleb's expression grew serious. "Our arrangement may be unconventional, but our marriage will be legal and binding. The ring is a symbol of that commitment, whatever form it ultimately takes." The thoughtfulness behind the gesture touched Margaret more deeply than she had anticipated. She extended her left hand, silently inviting him to place the ring himself. Caleb hesitated briefly, then took her hand in his larger one, sliding the band onto her finger with unexpected gentleness. The ring fitted as though made for her, its weight unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Margaret studied it against her work-roughened hand, the simple gold standing out against her pale skin. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll honor what it represents." Something shifted in Caleb's gaze, not quite warmth, but perhaps the first tentative step toward it. "Shall we go meet your new community, Miss Ainsley, soon to be Thornton?" The journey to Silver Springs passed more comfortably than their initial trip to the ranch. Seated beside Caleb in the wagon, Margaret found conversation flowing more easily between them. He pointed out landmarks and boundaries, naming neighboring ranches and describing the territory's seasonal changes. Margaret listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her quick grasp of the complex relationships between water access, grazing rights, and the challenging topography that defined ranching success or failure. "You understand these matters more readily than most Easterners," Caleb observed, as they crested a hill overlooking Silver Springs in the distance. "I've always believed that knowledge is security," Margaret replied. "The more I understand about this place and its workings, the more effectively I can contribute to the ranch's success." The slip didn't escape Caleb's notice, but he merely nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. A wise approach. Silver Springs appeared different to Margaret now as they approached, no longer the forbidding stranger it had seemed upon her. A rival. In just 2 days, her perspective had shifted dramatically. The scattered buildings now represented opportunity rather than intimidation. The rugged landscape promised freedom rather than isolation. Whether this change reflected actual possibility or merely desperate adaptation to her circumstances, she couldn't yet determine. As Caleb guided the wagon down the main street, several townspeople called greetings, their curious gazes lingering on Margaret. News of her arrival had clearly spread, along with speculation about her relationship with the respected rancher. She maintained a dignified posture, acknowledging greetings with polite nods while observing the subtle dynamics of the small community. "We'll see Reverend Collins first," Caleb said, as they passed the mercantile, where the owner stood watching their progress with undisguised interest. "Then introduce you properly around town." Margaret adjusted her bonnet, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way she hadn't been in years. While she harbored no illusions about transforming into a beauty, she felt an unexpected desire to present herself well as Caleb Thornton's chosen bride, regardless of the private reality of their arrangement. The church stood at the eastern edge of town, a simple white-painted structure with a crooked steeple that somehow added charm rather than diminishing its dignity. A small cottage nestled behind it, smoke rising from its chimney despite the mild spring day. Reverend Collins proved to be younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 35, with kind eyes and a scholarly demeanor that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. His wife, Elizabeth, a petite woman with a ready smile, welcomed them into the cottage parlor with genuine warmth. "Miss Ainsley, we're delighted to meet you at last," she exclaimed, taking Margaret's hands in her own. "When Mr. Thornton wrote that he was expecting a bride from the East, we were so pleased. Feminine influence is sorely needed in Silver Springs." Margaret glanced at Caleb, surprised to learn he had informed others of her impending arrival. He met her gaze with a slight shrug. "I needed to arrange for the wedding service," he explained, "and Mrs. Collins has been kind enough to offer guidance on household matters that might ease your transition." The thoughtfulness of this preparation touched Margaret unexpectedly. While Caleb had admitted disappointment in her appearance, he had nonetheless taken steps to ensure her comfort and integration into the community. Over tea, served in the Collins' modest parlor, arrangements were made for a wedding ceremony 3 days hence. Just a simple service, Margaret requested, conscious of both propriety and the unusual nature of their agreement. Our circumstances don't warrant elaborate celebrations. Nonsense, Elizabeth Collins countered with gentle authority. Every bride deserves some festivity, particularly one who has journeyed so far to begin a new life. We'll arrange a small reception at the hotel afterward, nothing extravagant, but enough to properly introduce you to Silver Springs society. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Caleb spoke first. Mrs. Collins is right, he said, surprising her again. Your arrival should be marked appropriately. You'll be mistress of one of the largest ranches in the territory. People will expect certain observations. The reminder of her future position silenced Margaret's objections. She was no longer simply Margaret Ainsley, mill worker from Vermont, but soon to be Mrs. Thornton, whose conduct would reflect on her husband's standing in the community. The realization brought both discomfort and a strange pride. Very well, she conceded, though I've brought few suitable garments for such an occasion. That's easily remedied, Elizabeth assured her. Mrs. Harrington at the Mercantile keeps a selection of fabrics, and I believe Mrs. Wilson still does some dressmaking, despite her advancing years. Following their visit to the parsonage, Caleb led Margaret through a series of introductions throughout the small settlement: the mercantile owner and his wife, the hotel proprietor, the town doctor, and his family. Everywhere they went, Margaret was received with varying degrees of curiosity and welcome, though she noted the assessing glances between married women silently evaluating Caleb's choice. They're wondering what he sees in her, she imagined them thinking, though no one spoke such thoughts aloud. The familiar judgment stung, despite her attempts at indifference. Their final stop was the Silver Springs Hotel, where Caleb had arranged for a private dining room for lunch. As they settled at a table overlooking the town's single street, Margaret found herself unexpectedly exhausted by the morning's social obligations. Maintaining a poised facade while navigating a new community had drained her more thoroughly than 14 hours at a mill loom ever had. You've handled yourself admirably, Caleb observed, studying her across the table. Not everyone transitions so smoothly to frontier society. I've merely been polite, Margaret demurred. Though I suspect many find me disappointing as your chosen bride, Caleb's expression sharpened. Has someone said something inappropriate? No one needs to speak for me to recognize familiar assessments, Margaret replied without self-pity. I've lived with such judgments my entire adult life, Mr. Thornton. Caleb, he corrected automatically, then frowned. What judgments do you imagine are being made? Margaret arranged her napkin precisely in her lap, buying time to formulate an honest response that wouldn't sound like self-pity. That I am plain, unremarkable, and therefore puzzling as the choice of a man in your position. That you might have secured someone more ornamental had you been more patient or offered greater inducements. Caleb's frown deepened. You attribute shallow thinking to people you've just met. I attribute to them the same responses I've observed throughout my life, Margaret countered. It's not accusation, merely experience. Their conversation paused as the hotel's proprietress herself arrived with their meal, a surprisingly well-prepared roast with spring vegetables that reminded Margaret how far civilization had penetrated, even this remote territory. When they were alone again, Caleb surprised her by returning to their interrupted discussion rather than allowing it to fade. I dislike thinking you feel judged in what will become your community, he said, his tone more gentle than she had yet heard from him. Particularly when the judgment you perceive may exist primarily in your own expectations. The observation, though not unkindly delivered, struck Margaret with unexpected force. Was it possible she projected anticipated rejection where none existed? Had years of dismissal in Millfield conditioned her to expect the same wherever she went? Perhaps, she acknowledged, willing to consider his perspective. Though your own initial reaction to my appearance suggests my expectations aren't entirely unfounded. A flush rose above Caleb's beard. I behaved poorly, he admitted, and have regretted it since witnessing your courage and composure during Holcomb's visit. Physical appearance reveals nothing about a person's character or capabilities. I know this, yet allowed superficial expectations to color our first meeting. The frank acknowledgement of his error, offered without qualification, elevated Margaret's estimation of Caleb's character significantly. Thank you for that, she said simply. Few men would admit such a mistake so directly. Our agreement includes absolute honesty, he reminded her, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. I intend to honor all aspects of our arrangement, Margaret. The use of her given name, spoken with unmistakable respect, created a subtle shift in the atmosphere between them. Not romance. Margaret harbored no illusions about miraculous transformations in Caleb's perception of her appearance, but perhaps the foundation for something equally valuable: genuine partnership based on mutual respect. After lunch, they separated. Briefly, Caleb to conduct banking business, while Margaret visited Mrs. Wilson, the elderly dressmaker Elizabeth Collins had recommended. The woman's small shop occupied the front room of her cottage at the edge of town, bolts of fabric lining the walls and a cutting table dominating the center space. Agatha Wilson herself proved to be a tiny bird-like woman with bright eyes that belied her 70-plus years. So you're Thornton's bride, she stated without preamble, circling Margaret with professional assessment. Good shoulders, nice posture. Turn, please. Startled by the direct approach, Margaret complied, allowing the older woman to study her figure from all angles. Yes, tall, strong build. Not what most men look for, but far more practical for frontier life than those delicate creatures who wilt at the first hardship. Mrs. Wilson's matter-of-fact assessment contained neither criticism nor false flattery. What did you have in mind for your wedding dress, dear? Something simple but appropriate, Margaret replied, warming to the dressmaker's straightforward manner. I brought few garments with me, expecting to create new ones more suited to ranch life. Sensible, Mrs. Wilson approved. Too many Eastern women arrive with trunks full of impractical frippery, then wonder why silk and lace don't survive washboards and cook fires. She moved to a cabinet, retrieving several fashion plates. For your wedding, perhaps something like this, modified for your figure and coloring. The illustration showed a gown more elegant than anything Margaret had ever owned, yet not excessively ornate. Its lines were clean, its decoration tasteful rather than ostentatious. It's lovely, Margaret acknowledged, but perhaps beyond my requirements. Our ceremony will be very simple. Mrs. Wilson fixed her with a penetrating stare. A wedding dress serves two purposes, young woman. It honors the significance of the occasion, yes, but it also establishes your position in the community. As Mrs. Thornton, you'll be expected to lead by example, in church activities, in social matters, perhaps eventually in motherhood. Your appearance at this first public event will set the tone for how people perceive you going forward. The perspective gave Margaret pause. She had considered only her own modest preferences and Caleb's practical nature, not the broader social implications of their union. I hadn't thought of it that way, she admitted. Few do, Mrs. Wilson replied with a knowing smile. But I've dressed brides in this territory for 30 years. Trust my experience in this matter. By the time Caleb returned to collect her, Margaret had been measured, had selected fabric, a rich ivory silk for the wedding gown, and several sturdier materials for everyday garments, and had arranged for fittings over the next 2 days. The expenses, which exceeded her modest budget, troubled her until Mrs. Wilson explained that Caleb had established an account for her use before their arrival. Another example of his thoughtfulness. she reflected as they drove back toward the ranch, the afternoon sun gilding the landscape. Perhaps there was more depth to Caleb Thornton than she had initially perceived, just as he was discovering qualities in her beyond her unremarkable appearance. The days before the wedding passed. In a whirlwind of activity, Margaret divided her time between preparations in Silver Springs and establishing herself at the ranch. She created meticulous inventories of household supplies, rearranged the kitchen for greater efficiency, and began the process of transforming Caleb's functional bachelor residence into a proper home without overstepping the bounds of their arrangement. Caleb, for his part, maintained a respectful distance while providing everything she requested. Each morning he departed after breakfast to work with his men. Each evening he returned for supper, which they shared with increasing comfort in each other's company. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond immediate practicalities to include their respective backgrounds, views on territorial politics, and even occasional philosophical discussions sparked by books from Caleb's surprisingly extensive library. "You're not what I expected," Margaret told him on the eve of their wedding as they sat before the fire, she with mending in her lap, he with a ledger of ranch accounts. "In what way?" Caleb asked, looking up from his figures with interest. "You present yourself as purely practical, yet you maintain a collection of poetry alongside agricultural journals. You speak of ranching in terms of profit and loss, yet describe the land with almost religious reverence." She set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. "You contain contradictions I hadn't anticipated." Caleb closed his ledger, considering her observation. "As do you, Margaret Ainsley. You describe yourself as plain and practical, yet I've watched you arrange wildflowers with an artist's eye and speak of literature with genuine passion. You claim to seek only security, yet you faced armed men without flinching to protect a home that wasn't yet yours." His perception startled her. "Perhaps we've both allowed ourselves to be defined too narrowly by others' assessments," she suggested. "Or by our own limited self-perception," Caleb added, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. "Tomorrow we begin a new chapter, with the opportunity to discover who we might become beyond those limitations." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. The Montana spring, offering its blessing in the form of wildflowers blanketing the valley and birdsong filling the air. Margaret woke early, a mixture of nervousness and strange anticipation fluttering in her stomach. By arrangement, Caleb had ridden into town the previous evening, staying at the hotel to maintain propriety before the ceremony. She would travel to Silver Springs with Silas, who had been designated her escort in Caleb's absence. Elizabeth Collins arrived at the ranch mid-morning, bringing her personal maid to assist with Margaret's preparations. "Every bride deserves attention on her special day," she insisted when Margaret protested such fuss, particularly one without mother or sisters to share the moment. The kindness nearly undid Margaret's carefully maintained composure. As Elizabeth's maid arranged her hair, weaving spring blossoms among the auburn strands, Margaret found herself blinking back unexpected tears. "It's perfectly natural to be emotional," Elizabeth assured her, misinterpreting the reaction. "Marriage is a momentous step, even when—" She hesitated, clearly uncertain how to continue. "Even when arranged through correspondence rather than developed through courtship," Margaret supplied, sparing the minister's wife further discomfort. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, relief evident in her tone. "Though I must say, you and Mr. Thornton seem remarkably well suited despite the unconventional beginning. There's a natural ease between you that many couples require years to develop." The observation surprised Margaret, who had assumed their interactions appeared as awkward to others as they sometimes felt to her. "We're both practical people," she said carefully. "We share similar values regarding hard work and building something worthwhile." "More than that, I think," Elizabeth replied with a knowing smile. but time will reveal what exists beyond practicality. Now let's get you into this gorgeous gown. Mrs. Wilson has outdone herself. The dress, when carefully removed from its wrappings, exceeded Margaret's expectations. The ivory silk shimmered in the morning light, its clean lines and subtle embellishments, creating an elegance she had never associated with herself. When finely dressed, her hair arranged, her mother's locket, her only jewelry besides Caleb's ring around her neck, Margaret hardly recognized the woman in the small mirror Elizabeth held before her. Not a conventional beauty, certainly no. Gown could transform her strong features or substantial frame into delicate femininity, but dignified, even striking in a way she had never thought possible. "You look magnificent," Elizabeth declared, genuine admiration in her voice. "Mr. Thornton will be speechless." Margaret doubted that, given their practical arrangement, but found herself hoping for at least a flicker of appreciation in Caleb's eyes. Despite their agreement, despite her own insistence that appearance shouldn't matter, she discovered within herself a very human desire to be found attractive by the man who would become her husband. The journey to Silver Springs passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Silas, unexpectedly gallant in a freshly pressed suit, treated her with a deference that would have amused Margaret under different circumstances. The other ranch hands had ridden ahead to witness the ceremony, their excited preparations that morning revealing how significant this event was to the entire Thornton Ranch community. "You've made quite an impression on the boys," Silas commented as they approached town. "Never seen them so eager to attend church services." "I believe a promise of wedding cake holds greater appeal than witnessing my matrimonial vows," Margaret replied with dry humor. Silas chuckled. "Perhaps, but there's more to it. You've brought possibility back to the ranch. After Catherine died, something went out of the place, not just Caleb's happiness, but a sense of future. Your arrival has restored that, even in these few days." The simple observation held more meaning than elaborate compliments might have. Margaret found herself speechless, touched by the implication that her presence already mattered beyond the practical arrangement she and Caleb had negotiated. Silver Springs had transformed itself for the occasion. Bunting decorated the church entrance, and it seemed the entire settlement had turned out in their Sunday best. As Silas helped her from the wagon, Margaret felt the weight of community expectations settle upon her shoulders. These people had come not just to witness a ceremony, but to evaluate the woman who would stand beside one of their most respected citizens. Inside the church, Elizabeth Collins ushered her to a small anteroom. "We'll begin in a few minutes," she explained, straightening Margaret's veil. "The church is full. Apparently everyone within 20 miles has found reason to attend services today." Margaret smoothed her gloves, fighting uncharacteristic nervousness. "I didn't anticipate such attention." "It's natural," Elizabeth assured her. "New arrivals are always objects of curiosity, especially when they're joining a prominent family. Just remember that beneath the scrutiny lies genuine goodwill. This community wants you and Caleb to find happiness together." Before Margaret could respond, organ music began, the small instrument's wheezy tones nevertheless creating an atmosphere of solemnity. Elizabeth slipped away, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts for one final moment before her life would change irrevocably. "I am ready," she told her reflection in the small mirror beside the door. "Whatever comes, I will face it with the same courage that brought me west." The ceremony itself passed in a dreamlike state. Margaret would later recall impressions rather than details, the church filled with unfamiliar faces, turning to watch her progress down the aisle. Silas's steady arm supporting her, Reverend Collins's kind expression as he welcomed them to the altar, and most vividly, Caleb's face as he turned to watch her approach. He looked different somehow, his features the same yet transformed by an expression she had not witnessed before. Not love, certainly. Their acquaintance was far too brief for such emotion, but unmistakable appreciation and something deeper, more significant: respect. As they exchanged vows, Caleb's voice remained steady, his dark eyes never leaving hers. When he placed the gold band on her finger, the temporary one now replaced with a permanent symbol of their union, his hands were warm and sure against her skin. And when Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the gentle pressure of Caleb's arm guiding her back down the aisle felt like silent communication. We are in this together now, for whatever may come. The reception at the Silver Springs Hotel brought Margaret face to face with the community that would now form her social circle. Women who had viewed her with curiosity now approached as equals, offering congratulations and invitations for future visits. Men who had barely acknowledged her presence before now treated her with the deference due Mrs. Caleb Thornton. Through it all, Caleb remained at her side, his hand occasionally resting at the small of her back as he introduced her to ranchers from outlying properties and their wives. His evident pride in presenting her, whether genuine or masterfully feigned, gradually eased Margaret's self-consciousness until she found herself genuinely enjoying the celebration. "You've charmed them all," Caleb murmured as they finally claimed a moment alone near the refreshment table. "Silas tells me 3 different ranchers' wives have already invited you to tea, and old Judge Blackwood hasn't stopped singing your praises since you discussed territorial water rights with him." "Hardly appropriate conversation for a wedding reception," Margaret acknowledged with a small smile. But the judge seemed genuinely interested in a woman's perspective on resource allocation. "That's precisely why you've impressed him," Caleb replied. "Most women arriving from the East avoid such topics entirely, yet you've already grasped the fundamental issues that shape our existence here." The approval in his voice warmed something deep within Margaret, a place untouched by previous compliments about her practical skills or domestic capabilities. To be valued for her mind, her observations, her unique perspective, this was validation she had scarcely dared hope for, even from the man who had proposed their pragmatic union. As afternoon faded toward evening, Caleb guided her toward the hotel entrance. "We should begin our journey home," he said, his use of the word home creating an unexpected flutter in Margaret's chest. "I'd prefer not to travel these roads after dark, especially with Holcomb's men still harboring grievances." The reminder of potential danger sobered Margaret's mood, bringing her back to the practical realities that had shaped their arrangement. As they bid farewell to their guests and departed amid good wishes and knowing smiles, she reminded herself that this was not a love match, but a partnership founded on mutual benefit. Yet as Caleb handed her into the wagon that would carry them back to Thornton Ranch, to their shared home and uncertain future, Margaret found herself hoping that something beyond mere practicality might eventually grow between them. Not the consuming passion of romantic novels, perhaps, but genuine affection built on respect, shared purpose, and the gradual discovery of each other's true nature. The Montana sunset painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. As they traveled homeward, the beauty surrounding them a silent promise of possibilities neither had anticipated when first committing to their unusual arrangement. And if Caleb's hand occasionally covered hers where it rested on the seat between them, well, that too seemed a promise of sorts, unspoken but nonetheless real. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.